Lou, thank you very much for agreeing to guide us through the Consolation of Philosophy. Lou, a lot of your work is about why Christians should read pagan classics and why they should even read pagan myths. Broadly, why do you think it's important for Christians to engage in this kind of literature?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Elliot. This is really my passion. It's what's called bringing Athens and Jerusalem together, taking and bringing together our Greco-Roman pre-Christian heritage and our Judeo-Christian heritage. Now, a lot of Christians, especially evangelicals, which is where I hail from, are a little bit suspicious. How can we learn anything from pre-Christian pagans? They're unregenerate. How can we learn? Won't they deceive us? Well, to understand why we can learn from the pagan classics, and I don't use pagan in a negative sense, it's just the pre-Christian Greeks and Romans. The reason we can learn from them is because of the very important theological distinction between general revelation and special revelation. Now, special revelation is the way God speaks directly to people. And he does that through the prophets in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and supremely through Christ. But Elliot, that is not the only way God speaks. That's the only direct special revelation that we focus on. But God also speaks to all people generally through creation, through nature, as it says in Romans chapter 1, through our conscience, as it says in Romans chapter 2. But God also speaks through our reason, through our imagination, and, to quote C.S. Lewis, through the good dreams of the pagans. Elliot, a lot of times the pre-Christians didn't have the answers because they lacked the special revelation of the Bible and of Christ. But they often asked the right questions. We were all made in God's image, and although we're fallen and depraved, we still retain the imago Dei, the image of God. And so we can learn real truths from reading these great pagan classics. But of course, we want to measure things ultimately against the special revelation of Christ and the Bible. So that, in a nutshell, is why we can read and learn from the pagan classics.
Boethius is something of a problem case in the sense that he is a Christian. He writes theological tracts that show he's an Orthodox Christian. He has been a classic for many Christians. And yet his most famous book, The Consolation of Philosophy, doesn't include anything about Christ. In what sense should we see this as a Christian classic, if indeed we should?
It is fascinating. And we need to say that Boethius was a Christian and almost surely died a martyr. He was serving a man named Theodoric, who was the leader of the Ostrogoths. And this man was almost surely an Arian. Those were the people that denied the deity of Christ. And so, of course, they weren't believing Christians. And at first, Theodoric seemed to like Boethius, even seemed to help him to become a council of Rome. This is like, late Rome now. But he fell foul with Theodoric, probably because he was an Orthodox Christian, and eventually he was martyred. Now, he did write Christian reflections. He wrote books about logic and music that influenced education. But while he was in prison, he decided to write a book called The Consolation of Philosophy. What he meant by that is, what consolation can we take from philosophy? What can we learn from it that can help us to weather the storms of life? And he's going through a pretty big storm of life in prison. And again, eventually he was martyred. Now, what he did is odd. It seems odd to us, but it wasn't necessarily odd back then. He decided when he wrote this book to see what truth he could gain from the best of general revelation. And when that comes to philosophy, that means Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and some of the Stoics and Epicureans. People, particularly the famous Stoic Marcus Aurelius. There was also a Stoic named Seneca, another named Epicurus, and just the Neoplatonists in general. He wanted to see how much we can learn from that general revelation. And the closest I can give to it is I myself write a lot of Christian books, but sometimes I'll write a book for a more general audience. And so sometimes in those books, I might not quote the scriptures because I figure my audience may not believe in it. But that doesn't mean I'm not guided by other truths that are compatible with Christianity and that point towards Christianity. So if I'm speaking at a secular museum, let's say secular humanist museum, I can still teach a lot of real truths without necessarily quoting the Bible as the authoritative and inerrant word of God. So Boethius he's not the only person that does it. We seem to know that people would experiment with these things. But what he showed us is that there's a lot we can learn from not just Plato and Aristotle, but we can take some of the myths, some from, let's say, Homer or Hesiod or Ovid, and if we know from the special revelation the ultimate truth, we can identify in those myths bits and pieces of truth that have a sort of spiritual significance that the Christian can learn from. And just a quick look, I don't know if you've done this, but if you want to teach your child, maybe your son, you want to teach him balance and moderation, things that certainly fit in with Christ's teaching, you might tell him the famous story of Daedalus and Icarus. Most people know that story. Daedalus built wings so that he and his son could escape from the labyrinth where they'd been imprisoned. And when he put the wings on his son, he told him, son, don't fly too low or the weight of the water will make the feathers wet and drag you down, but don't fly too close to the sun or the sun will melt the wax, the feathers will fall out, and you'll die. Take a middle course. But of course, the son is young. He starts thinking he's a bird. He flies too low. He flies too high. The wax melts, and he falls to his death. I wrote a book called The Myth Made Fact, where I show how lots of these ancient myths, some of them very strange and even terrifying, have lessons that can strengthen in a sort of devotional way a Christian reader, and especially a Christian reader reading to their children and trying to teach them Christian lessons.
So we will talk about, no doubt, Boethius doing that very explicitly later on. If I could just for a moment zoom in on the historical period into which Boethius was born. So he's born in Rome, but this is a Rome under the control of Goths, or the Ostrogoths, and Theodoric is the king, as you said, for most of his life. What was it like for Boethius growing up in this environment?
It was very strange. So just to get a ballpark, St. Augustine is around 400, Boethius is around 500. So they don't quite overlap, but they're within 100 years of each other. And again, Rome was sacked in 410, and then finally in 453, it's finished, but it doesn't disappear. The barbarians from the north, the Franks and whatnot, at this point, like you said, the Goths and the Ostrogoths, they maintain much of the Roman structure of government with the Senate and things like that. But because Rome has lost its integrity, it's not so easy to keep the various barbarians. So there's a lot of people competing for power, and many people will know that eventually out of that, we get what's called the Holy Roman Empire. At this point, the church is still a little bit too weak to actually bring law and order to the empire. They can bring law and order to the individual souls of their parishioners, but it's going to take a while, really not till 800, when you've got Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, officially so, and a strong enough church to bring order and peace. So now there is the remains, the leftover of Roman order and the Roman peace, but things are very precarious. Now, many people will know that in 325 AD, Constantine called for the Nicene, for a council, an ecumenical council at Nicaea. And there in 325, partly helped by Athanasius, a great theologian, they did declare Christian orthodoxy, right? That Jesus was fully man and fully God. Now, what the Arians said, that he was, a man, a height man, right? The highest of all men, but still not equal to God. Well, a lot of people don't realize that even though theologically the Arians were defeated in 325, they held on for several more hundred years. And part of the reason for that was many of the barbarian soldier, sort of warrior people clung to Arianism. And if you think about it, Arianism is a great religion for soldiers. God is God. That's it. Okay. We don't need all this fine theology and things like that. It's just simple and straightforward and sort of authoritarian. So even Athanasius himself had a run. He was sent into exile again and again and again. So it's kind of hard to believe, but 150 years after Nicaea, we still have leftovers of Arianism. But again, on certain matters, the Christians and Arians could work together. And Boethius was an intellectual, an expert in Latin, an expert in logic and music, in what we call classical Christian education today. And so Boethius, with all of his skills, was able to work his way up in the court of Theodoric. And again, oddly, even though the Roman Empire as we know it is gone, Boethius was able to become a council, that they were these two presidents sort of that were able to call the shots, not complete power, but able to do things. And yet, again, it's a time of instability where you can sort of go up and go down. And it's interesting that it's Boethius who popularized the image of Lady Fortune or Dame Fortune, who turns her wheel of fortune. And maybe Boethius identified with that because he himself sort of went up, great scholar, all of this stuff, and then fell foul of the Arian king Theodoric. So it's the shadow of Rome, if you will.
And he's born into an elite family, which enables him to get ahead and to get an education in the classics. At the time he is growing up, Plato's Academy is still open, but he probably doesn't go there, but he suddenly reads in Greek. Can we talk about some of the influences on his thought?
Again, one of it would be, and again, Augustine, people that have read the Confessions will know that Augustine went through a period when he was a Neoplatonist. There was a very influential writer named Porphyry. There was another one named Plotinus. And Boethius would have studied people like Plotinus and Porphyry, would have studied Platonism as filtered through the Neoplatonists. And one of the things he would have studied, one of the things that I find him so helpful, is the concept, which what I like to call ascending the rising path. There is this sense of spiritual growth. And sometimes these Neoplatonists can almost make Christians look bad, right? I mean, our salvation is by faith in Christ, it's done, but we're still meant to grow and be sanctified and to rise up to be more like Christ. And some of these Neoplatonists, although they didn't know Christ, understood the importance, the desire to move away from what Christians would call the flesh and move more towards spiritual truths. Now, the problem with the Neoplatonists, even more so than Plato, the problem with the Neoplatonists is that they had a dualistic view of soul and body, where the soul was good and the body was bad, and the soul was struggling eventually to come free of the body. Now, the ironic thing is that there are many Christians, particularly in America, who without realizing have bought into what really is a heresy, the idea that soul is good and body is bad. In fact, soul and body are both good, created in God's image, but both fallen at the same time. So some of the things he would have learned from these followers of Plato and Aristotle was how to live a virtuous life, how to avoid excess, how not to be controlled by lust and greed, and how to moderate your desires, right? He would have been also influenced by the Stoics. Again, people like Epicurus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius are the three most famous Stoics. They were the ones, we still use that word Stoic. And I've often said that if it could be proven that Christ didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity would be defunct. And what would you do? I think I've become a Stoic. I think it's the most manly option if God has not, in fact, spoke and died and rose again. So I think he would have gotten a lot of good influences from the best of Greco-Roman. See, Eliot, these philosophers were not just teaching abstract philosophy. They were often part of schools, philosophical schools, where they were trying to live these things out and learn to control their temporal and control their lust. But many people have heard there was a group called the Epicureans. And today we think, and the Epicureans were hedonists. They believed the most important thing was pleasure. But in our modern day, we seem to think the Epicureans were running around getting drunk and sleeping around all the time. But the greatest of the Epicureans said, well, yes, the goal of life is pleasure, but if you overindulge yourself with, fornication and drinking and stuff like that, all you're going to do is hurt your body, and then you're going to be miserable. So a lot of these Epicureans, even though they put pleasure first, often like the Stoics, try to live more moderate lives. And that would have been some of the things that Boethius studied, along with Christianity.
After his education, or his education is obviously ongoing throughout his life, he and you see that in the Consolation, is still trying to live up to the ideal of philosophy. He becomes a kind of politician come philosopher in the sort of mode of Cicero. All the time he's becoming a politician, he's rising to consul, to something like prime minister under the King Theodoric. He's got these writing projects. Could you tell us about some of those and what he's hoping to achieve?
Oh, the ones that we know about is he wrote about music and the influence of music. And that's very Platonic, because in Plato's Republic, he spends a great deal of time, actually Aristotle was a little bit too, but especially Plato spends a lot of time talking about the good and bad influence of music. And that's something we probably need to learn from today. So he wrote about that, the idea of rhythm and balance. A classical education then and today, it's been revived, follows what's called the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium means grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium is mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. And if you think about it, the trivium all has to do with letters, with words, the way we understand words, the way we put them together, the way we use them to persuade, things like that. Whereas the quadrivium has to do with the numbers, right? Whether it's the numbers in math, or it's the numbers spread out in space that gives us astronomy, whether it's numbers in time, which is in a sense what music is. And Boethius is one who really understood not only the importance of logic and words, but he understood as well the power of numbers. And what we have of him, he's writing about those things. And it seems to have had a lot of influence on the educators of his day.
And aside from his original work, he's also translating Greek texts into Latin, and he embarks...
Right, he translated some of Aristotle, I believe.
Translates some of Aristotle, and he wants to translate all of Aristotle and as much of Plato as he can into Latin, and he never completes that project. But his translations and commentaries become enormously influential in the medieval period.
It's kind of interesting, Eliot, because later on, his Consolation of Philosophy, that we'll talk about in a moment, was later translated into English by Alfred the Great, by Chaucer, and I believe some say even by Elizabeth I. But you're right. We probably should have said that. Okay, by the time we get to Augustine, like I said, that's around 400. Augustine actually knows very little Greek and sort of scorns it and writes. And the very early church fathers before Tertullian wrote in Greek. After Tertullian, they wrote in Latin. And by the time we get to Boethius, Greek is quickly becoming a lost language. And it would be lost for almost 1,000 years. It would be kept, of course, over in Byzantium, Constantinople. But that's why Boethius tried to do this translation, because Greek, when the Greek New Testament was lost, everybody was reading the Vulgate, which was the Latin translation done by Jerome 100 years earlier, the same time as Augustine. So that's why that's an important thing that Boethius tried to do.
Because he is, along with Augustine and Aristotle, he's one of the most important figures in medieval philosophy. He shapes its whole course through his original work and through his translation. But the Consolation has always been the most popular and the most enduringly popular work by Boethius. We get into the book and we see that Boethius is one of the main characters, and we find out about his predicament. Can you tell us about how Boethius, the character Boethius, is at the beginning of the book? How does he feel, and what is his predicament?
It's very interesting because he's given in to despair, and it seems like he's turned to consolation to poetry, to the muses, to entertainment, and things like that. And it's obviously not working. And there's sort of an amazing beginning to Consolation, where Lady Philosophy allegorized a beautiful woman, appears to him and scolds him for giving way to the siren song of the muse. Not so much that poetry is evil, but it becomes frivolous in sight of philosophy, which is the higher pursuit. Especially Plato thought that philosophy was the higher pursuit. It's funny, though, that the Consolation of Philosophy was written in a strange mixture of poetry and prose. He sort of goes back and forth between poetry and prose to show that both of them are important. And I should mention here that those of your listeners who are fans of Dante's Divine Comedy, towards the end of Purgatory, Dante is reunited with Beatrice, the woman he loved from afar. He never married her, but the woman he loved from afar. And he's all excited when he sees Beatrice, thinking Beatrice will come up and give him a big hug and kiss and tell him what a good boy you are. But instead, Beatrice just lays into him and said, "What are you doing? When I died, you should have followed my soul to heaven, not die, but you should have been lifted up to higher things rather than being drawn down to lower things." And again, she scolds him in and out. And a lot of people don't realize that Dante, who was a huge fan of Boethius, that Dante patterns that whole scene of the angry Lady Philosophy who must make him repent for his giving in to the siren, and that's the word that Beatrice uses as well, is actually coming right from Boethius. And so this is a kind of literature that is not as popular today. That's allegory, right? Where you take something abstract and you make it concrete in some kind of image. So we can say Pilgrim's Progress is the best example of a allegory, where despair is allegorized as a giant who grabs Christian and his friend and throws him in prison in the dungeon of despair. And that's kind of what despair feels like. It's like a terrible giant locking us up. So that's what Bunyan does. But what Boethius is doing here is trying to allegorize the war or conflict between philosophy and poetry as these two ladies. And of course, if you think about it for a moment, he's kind of getting that from the Bible, isn't he? Because there is Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly who are competing for Solomon or whoever's son's attention. And so it is Greco-Roman allegory, but it's also biblical if you read Proverbs carefully.
So could we go into a bit more detail about what precisely is the problem with the muses of poetry, with poetry?
It kind of, in this sense, goes back to Plato, and that is that the muses are dealing with the surface rather than dealing with the truth. Plato famously says that poetry is an imitation of an imitation. That rather than, and then Aristotle disagreed on this, but rather than poetry drawing us closer to the truth, it actually draws us away. It's like a veiling of a veiling. And so these muses are sort of fickle, and they're not really taking you to the truths that endure, to the central, deeper truths. And Lady Philosophy is one who can reveal to him the way things really are. not just reflections, but the truths of things.
So Boethius has turned to poetry because he finds himself imprisoned by Theodoric, and he's fallen from almost the highest rank he could hold. He's lost his good name, his wealth, his freedom, and he's bemoaning the fact that bad things happen to good people and like himself.
Right.
What can philosophy promise him? What kind of consolation does she
It's
offer?
wonderful, and they're not exactly the same, but Dame Fortune ends up being as fickle as the Muses, right? And here's the problem, okay? Boethius is very foolish when he says, well, I had good fortune, and now fortune has abandoned me. And Lady Philosophy says, this would be like a young man falling in love with his beautiful girl who he knows has dated 5 men before him and has made them very happy for 1 month and then dropped them cold and left them despairing. And this foolish young man, boy number 5, thinks, oh, Dave, this girl will be different for me, right? It will just last for a month. It will go on forever. If he only understood the true nature of this person, of this fickle person, he wouldn't be complaining. So you're happy and you're praising Dame Fortune, and then when she acts the way she does, it's in her nature to turn her wheel and take you to the bottom. Why are you cursing her out? It's kind of a weird thing because Lady Philosophy does not like Dame Fortune, but in a weird way, she also defends Dame Fortune, maybe because she's a fellow woman or something like that. But in a way, she's also ironically defending her by saying, why are you putting curses on Fortune? That is her nature. She takes you up and she takes you down. And you were happy enough to praise her when she took you up. But when she followed her natural course and took you down, why are you complaining? You need to tie your star not to something as fickle as fortune that goes up and down and up and down. You need to find that which is permanent, which of course is philosophy. You need to seek after the good life and not the frivolous life that goes up and down. And to me, that's we can learn from that as well. I just kind of laughed about it, and there was a big thing in America a while back where people are saying, "Oh, this newscaster lady was really pretty, and now she's not so pretty, and now they're letting her go." I remember thinking to myself, well, it kind of depends on the situation. If the only reason she got the job in the first place was because she was prettier than the other ones, then how can she complain that she's losing the job because there's others more pretty than her? And then that wasn't always the case. But what I'm saying is, we need to understand that and come to grip reality as it is. And for lack of a better word, Lady Philosophy is giving Boethius a reality check.
So there's a sense in which he doesn't need consoling at all. He just needs to see that if he understands things correctly, all is good.
And one thing we need to understand, and then it's in Boethius, it's also in Cicero, but it's not going to be fully developed. It's in Aristotle too, until we get to the Middle Ages. And C.F. Lewis talks about this in the Discarded Image. And in the Discarded Image, he talks about Boethius, and that's a good book to read to learn more about some of the things we're talking about here. But anyway, the way the medievals and leading up to that saw themselves as living in a 2-tiered universe. And the dividing line between the 2 tiers was the moon. Now, Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun. The medievals would have said there's nothing new under the moon, because everything sublunar, everything under the moon, is in constant change. That's what Plato calls the world of becoming. Nothing has actually arrived yet. It's always becoming. Things are dying and being reborn. They're going in an endless cycle. And in fact, one of Dante's great contributions, and he's kind of getting it from Boethius, is to say that, okay, for the medievals, all of the spheres, all the planets were in crystal, and they were guided by this intelligence, this sort of spiritual being, this angel-like being. And the earth doesn't spin. And yet Dante says, well, there is an angel that watches over the earth, but that angel is Dame Fortune. He's getting a ref from Boethius. And she is the one who is, the earth is still because it's ceaselessly changing, but not actually going anywhere at the same time. So everything, but we need to understand that everything below the moon is in constant change. We can't expect things to remain the same. Everything above the moon is fixed. They believe that the heavens were perfect. The heavens did spin, but Aristotle said when something spins infinitely fast in a perfect circle, then it will never decay. It will always be perfect because there's something perfect about the circle. And that was so influential, Eliot, that even people like Copernicus and Galileo were still thinking that the cycles were circles. We needed to get it. Was it Kepler who was the one that finally realized they were an ellipsis? Because the image of the circle was so utterly powerful, even in the early Renaissance, that they couldn't shake it. But anyway, that's a long digression. But the idea is that philosophy has to remind him that only in the heavens, only in what Plato called the world of being, only up there are things fixed and perfect. Down here, things are ceaselessly changing because that's the nature of the world in which you live in, which is watched over by Dame Fortune.
So you mentioned discarded image there. Something Lewis says, which goes against the assumption many people make when they read the book, is that he doesn't believe Boethius, at the time of writing, knows that he's going to be sentenced to death. I wonder what you think of that. I find it quite compelling when Lewis argues the case.
I do think so, because, there's always going to be appeals and things like that. And, even under the barbarians, Rome is about law and order. They're usually about justice. Trials, where we learned everything about trials and things like that goes back to the Romans. And so I do remember he said that I think it is possible that he's trying to find consolation, but he doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know yet. And at least from what I've read, it sounds like what they did is they put like a rope around your head and they twisted and twisted and twisted to your eyes pop out. I mean, it doesn't sound like a very pleasant way to die. But yeah, I would agree that he still doesn't know what his fate is. He's just trying to live in that moment and find consolation there.
It sounds a horrible martyrdom. And I think on that sort of reading, that makes the very beginning, I think, where he talks about how death won't come. It will strike you down in the midst of life, but won't strike you down when you're despairing. It makes death too a part of fortune's wheel, rather than an inevitability he's writing under. That's sort of taken us to look at the nature of true goods. So we've talked about fortune, we've talked about her fickle nature. What instead should we be looking for if we're seeking out the good?
Well, we need to, we would say, it sounds like a cliche, but we need to use what is given to us for growth. So everything's going great. Let's be thankful. Let's grow, but let's not waste the suffering that Boethius is going through, because this suffering can build character, can build perseverance. So we want to grow and learn. I don't know if you're a fan of The Once and Future King by T.H. White, but there's one place where, I'm trying to remember, I think Merlin taught Arthur, when everything falls apart and you're betrayed and all of this happens, there's only one thing for it. And he says, learn why the world wags and what wags. I think that's the exact book that I remember reading when I was a kid. So let's use this opportunity to grow and to take our eyes off that which is fickle and fix it on that which is permanent. Let's try to understand the nature of the universe, the nature of goodness, the nature of growth. And ultimately, we're going to focus on God. Now, again, we're writing in a pre-Christian mode, so it's more like Aristotle's unmoved mover, right? The God that is sort of outside and moves all things, and everything moves in love for God. So the theology is still going to be fairly simplistic, but it's not going to necessarily contradict Christianity. It's going to be a lesser version of what is to be revealed later. I mean, obviously before, but later after Plato and Aristotle is kind of what we're getting at there.
The idea here is that perfect good and perfect happiness are not merely in God; they literally are God. God literally is the perfect good, and union with God is the way to find perfect happiness.
Right, and people have the two great books of virtue from Greece are Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says the ultimate telos, the purposeful end, the goal, the purpose of life is happiness. This Greek word eudaimio, which is almost more like well-spirited or balanced or whatever, and it's not happiness in the frivolous sense that we think of it today. Most people think of it today, but it's happiness, a sort of deep-seated contentment, being at peace with everything. I mean, I'll just give you an example of something where I think we can learn from the pagans, even at their most erroneous, right? Pythagoras was one of the first people in the West to believe in reincarnation. Now, of course, reincarnation is completely incompatible with Christianity. But what he says is so interesting. He says that we keep coming back, Pythagoras says, we keep coming back until we reach such a pitch of philosophy. We are so at peace, so at one with things that we can actually hear the music of the spheres. That's the music that the universe sings, but we don't hear it because our ears are so dull. But we get to a point where we are so in keeping with that, we hear that music, and then we will be released and we'll sort of join the universe. Now, again, completely incompatible with Christianity, and yet there's something about that idea of spiritual growth. The Christians of the Middle Ages, particularly Aquinas, but others, looking back to Plato, spoke about the ultimate thing as the beatific vision, which means the not beautiful, but the blessed vision. That for both Plato and Aristotle, the highest life is not the life of action, it's the life of contemplation. And Dante also says this too, by the way, in the comedy, that the highest goal of life is a life of pure contemplation, to contemplate the goodness and truth and beauty that is God, because God is the ultimate good and the measure of all other goods. So that is what we are moving towards. A little bit mystical, but that's Christianity too. Maybe a little more Greek Orthodox than Protestant, but that is a very old understanding of Christianity, the ultimate goal of the Christian.
And the identification of truth and goodness is absolutely central to Boethius here, and that's a very classical idea. That's in Plato from the early dialogues.
It is the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those are the three transcendentals that we are coming and moving toward.
And these stand. So, could we just to explain that further still? Can you tell us the relation that the things that people do in fact pursue, like wealth, power, position, fame, and pleasure in Boethius, stand to God or to the good?
Again, he doesn't use the Bible, but seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. It's these things, as wonderful as they sound, fame and fortune, all that sort of stuff, they're ultimately fleeting. They ultimately will go up and down with Dame Fortune. They're part of our sublunar world under the sun, and they don't bring permanent happiness. Permanent happiness is found ultimately in the contemplation of God, the contemplation of the good, the true, and the beautiful, or we would say the absolute good. Sometimes Plato spoke of the good as the sort of form of the forms. It was the ultimate thing, the ultimate good. Where at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, when Dante's lost in the dark wood and he looks up the mountain, he sees the sun shining, he recognizes it as sort of God's grace, and he wants to go up there. But Virgil tells him you have to take the long way around, down through Inferno, up Purgatory, up Paradise. And in some ways, Boethius is taking the long way around. He's maybe the best way to say it is he needs to take his eyes off the things of the world, the things that fade, and focus. This is the best way to put it. Hopefully in the UK, they also sing this beautiful hymn, Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're talking about. Take your eyes off the shadows and fix them. And the more we fix our eyes on the light, the more unappealing the shadows will become. They'll be dark. We won't even care about them.
We promised earlier that we'd talk about his employing classical myth to explain his philosophical point. Could you tell us about that in Boethius?
Well, yeah, there are two myths, I mean, they go back to Plato, but they go back to Homer, but he's probably getting them from Ovid, Ovid's Metamorphoses. That, as Lewis says, there were three books that were the bridge from the classical world, part of which was lost, to the Latin Catholic world in the Middle Ages. And those were Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Virgil's Aeneid. But anyway, he tells two stories. One is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and the other is the story of Odysseus's men turned to swine by Circe. Right now, other Neoplatonists like Porphyry had often allegorized. This is kind of funny, Ellie. We don't realize this, but there were a lot of higher pagans. Okay, they were not Christians, but they were higher pagans. They were moving. They're not monotheists, but they're moving towards something like a standard, at least, right? And a lot of them loved Homer, right? But what are you supposed to do with all these crazy, very ungodly gods that are sleeping around? What do you do with them? There were a lot of pagan writers like that who wanted to keep the myth because they recognized truth in it, but they didn't want to take with it the bad paganism that they saw as bad. And so they allegorized those stories to find a deeper truth. And there were, there was a Jewish thinker named Philo, Philo, and he did that just like the pagans, Porphyry did it. But people like Boethius and Origen before him also did this. They recognized truth, but it was a truth that needed to be filtered and cleansed of its dark paganism to reveal a kernel of truth. Okay, but most people know the story. Odysseus lands on the island of Circe. He breaks his men into two groups. The one group, led by another man, go in there. Circe meets them. She gives them beautiful food and beautiful wine, but in the wine, she puts a noxious drug. Once they drink the wine, she touches them on the snout, on the nose with her wand, and they're all transformed into swine. Odysseus wants to save his men. He rushes in, but luckily, Hermes, Mercury, the god messenger of the gods, wants to help Odysseus. So he gives Odysseus a antidote, what's called moly. Holy moly, right? What's called moly. And he says, when Circe gives you her drink, put the moly in there. That will be the counteragent. Then when she tries to turn you into swine, you can grab the wand and basically domesticate her. And what he's saying is that Circe is sort of the world, right? And those who do not know the truth end up being sucked in by the world and transformed into lower animals. Plato talked about reincarnation, as did Pythagoras before him. But those who know the secret wisdom, the truth, that moly, right? They can take the world and use it for good, sort of. So it's an allegory of good and evil and how we can take. Circe is sometimes referred to as the world itself, the world's body. And we can take Circe's brew and use it for spiritual strength rather than becoming a beast. But I think the other one is a little bit easier to understand. And that is Orpheus and Eurydice. Okay, most people know that Orpheus and Eurydice were married, beautiful honeymoon, but then Eurydice is bitten on the ankle by a poisonous snake. She dies and is taken into the underworld. Orpheus, in great grief, wanders the whole world looking for the doorway to Hades. After a long, long search, he finds the doorway and he makes his way down deeper and deeper and deeper into the underworld. And he comes before Hades or Pluto and says, Hades, please give me back my wife. She died too young. And Hades refuses. And that's when Orpheus, the greatest musician of all time, pulls out his lyre or lute sometimes and begins to sing of love. And as he sings, Pluto himself weeps iron tears, as Milton said in his verse. And the Furies beat their breasts and wept, right? And all of hell sort of stopped. And Pluto, or Hades, was so moved, he said, "You may take your bride back with you, but you must not look at her until you get back into the upper world. If you look back at her too soon, you will lose her forever." And so he leads her up the long stairway, never looking back. But as he gets close to the top, maybe it's fear, whatever, he thinks maybe Hades has deceived him, because after all, Eurydice is still a ghost, and so her feet make no sound on the stairs. And so just to check, he makes a quick backward glance, and the last thing he sees is Eurydice, a wind grabbing her and blowing her back down into the underworld, right? And what is this allegory? The allegory is we must keep our eyes fixed on the heavenly things. We must not look back. If we are to ascend out of the Hades of this world, the darkness of the world, we must keep our eyes on the prize. We must keep our eyes fixed on goodness, truth, and beauty. Because if we look back, we will be drawn back down into the world. So both of those myths, and I'm elaborating a bit, Boethius is trying to get from them a truth that will help us on our spiritual journey, so we go up rather than back down.
God is goodness, and we should be ascending up to him. But that brings us to the next part of the consolation, which is that if God is goodness, why is there evil in the world? And this is what Lady Philosophy is set to answer next.
I think one of the great things that Boethius gives us, and Lewis quotes this many times, I mean, ultimately, evil is a misuse of free will, right? He would agree with Augustine that evil is a privation or a negation or a perversion of the good. But here's the real deeper question that Boethius handles right there at the end of the Consolation. And Lewis quotes it many Screwtape letters, but other places he quotes it as well. All right. Almost all Christians believe that God knows the future, right? Well, if God foreknows, foreknowledge, right? If God foreknows the future, must he not therefore also predestine everything, right? And of course, if he predestines everything, then is he predestining evil? Is he predestining our evil choices? Back and forth, right? What Boethius says, and I think it's just a brilliant thing, is that the problem is that when we say God foreknows the future, we are making an error. God does not foreknow anything. God only knows. God is outside of time and space. He does not foreknow the future. He knows the future because he lives in an eternal now. Elliot, too many people think that eternity means taking the timeline and going on forever. But that's infinity maybe. But eternity means no time at all. Lewis, kind of looking back to Boethius, says the closest intimation we have in eternity is a present moment. When you have one of those moments where you seem to live your whole life, it's that moment where time and eternity touch each other. So, if God knows the future, or let's change words now. God does not foresee the future. God sees the future. Well, if I see you in the present moment doing something, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm causing you to do it. I mean, it could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm causing you to do it. I'm just seeing you do it. Well, when God sees the future, he sees the future the way we see the present, because God sees everything in his eternal manner. So God knows everything and sees everything because he's outside of time. But that doesn't necessarily mean he is causing the misuse of free will that ushers evil into the world, Adam and Eve, but also maintains that evil and brings greater evil. And then, like I said, Lewis quotes this often, and I think it's a very helpful way of reconciling, foreknowledge and predestination, whatnot. And it's just interesting that Boethius kind of getting ideas from Aristotle and whatnot. Augustine sort of speaks about time in that way, but Boethius sort of perfects it right there at the end of the Consolation.
And this is the part of the book that people are most likely to be familiar with, because this is the part 5 that's really taken up by philosophers today. And if you do encounter Boethius in a seminar, it's likely to be this passage that you look at.
It's interesting, Elliot. I teach at Houston. Well, it was Houston Baptist University. Now we call it Houston Christian University. And one of my colleagues is William Lane Craig, who teaches part of our apologetics. And he comes up with this sort of Molinism, middle knowledge, trying to find a way between sort of Calvinism and this idea we're talking about, Boethius. It's interesting. I don't know if it works fully, but people are still debating that and trying to understand how these things are. There are even some Christians who speak of God as if he's living in time with us, which I think is a little bit problematic. So there's still the dialogue continues.
There was one part of the work a little bit earlier that I would like to pick up, and that's the distinction made between providence and fate. Could you explain that distinction and why it's important?
Again, so often in the barbarians, especially the Germanic barbarians, if you ever read any Norse mythology, that Teutonic stuff is so dark and fated. Destiny is all, as it says in the Lost Kingdom, the Last Kingdom. So fate again is something that is still in a way tied to this world. It's still a kind of locked-in kind of destiny. But providence, and the word providence, a lot of people don't realize it. Pro means before, and the VID, think of the word video, which is something you see. Providence literally means to see before. So when we say God provides, we ultimately mean that God sees before what our needs are and provides them. So providence is something that is much higher than fate, that sees everything all at once. The analogy often used is if you're, we just celebrated the 4th of July, Trader Day over there. And the idea is that if I'm watching a 4th of July parade, right, I'm seeing the parade go by, float by float, float by float. But imagine somebody in a helicopter who watches the parade and sees all of it from beginning to middle to end all at once. Providence has that higher kind of vision that sees everything and sees how it all fits together. Whereas fate is something that, you can tie it up to the influence of the stars and astrology as we still see it today, being part of that system, what will later become a clockwork universe under Newton. But again, we're talking about something higher than fate. We're talking about the God who sees all and knows all and understands the plan from beginning to end.
So providence is kind of God's plan, and fate is the playing out of that plan in time. And one just question on that point. Why then, how does this form part of the answer to the question of why we see evil around us, why we see bad things happening to good people, good things happening to bad people? How does that distinction help us make sense?
We're only seeing the part of the parade that we're part of. We're seeing the little small acts and scenes working themselves out, but we're not seeing the whole play from beginning to end. We're not getting a grasp of the whole thing. use another analogy. I can't think of one now. But we're like the characters inside the play, and Providence is the playwright that is outside the play. And I just think of something that Lewis says, that of course Boethius doesn't go this far, but Boethius says, imagine if you're Shakespeare and you want to speak to your characters who are stuck inside the play, how can you really do it? And the ultimate way to do it is to write yourself into the play as a character. And that's the part that Boethius is not getting to, because he's dealing with general revelation. But you're sending things. They are working out within the framework of the play. We only see that part of it. We don't see the wholeness of the picture. I guess the best way I can explain it. Kind of a difficult concept.
You've spoken about some instances already, but could you tell us about how the book has been received and how it's been influential across time?
It's kind of interesting. First of all, the idea of Dame Fortune has been very, very influential. Also, like we said, the idea of providence and fate and foreknowledge and choice and things like that. But it's funny because, like I said, Chaucer actually translated Boethius. And what's really neat about this is if you read the Knight's Tale, which is the first really long tale of Canterbury Tales, there's a part of that where basically Chaucer is directly quoting Boethius. But to me, I think the most interesting influence that Boethius had was in its genre, a different way. Okay, let's look at the Knight's Tale. Okay, Chaucer was a believer. Nobody knows what Shakespeare believed. He was obviously in a Christian culture, but there are things that Chaucer tells us that make it pretty clear that he was a believer. And yet, and there are many Christian characters in Canterbury Tales, but when he writes the Knight's Tale, which again, that's the longest tale, he sets the Knight's Tale in a pre-Christian world. And so even though maybe Chaucer, the Christian, would have liked to have injected Christianity into Knight's Tale, when he wrote the Knight's Tale, he remains true to the people and the characters that are living within that pre-Christian pagan world. And I think he's learning how to do this from Boethius, which is probably the reason why he literally quotes Boethius' Consolation in the Knight's Tale. Again, it's always hard to know what, but Beowulf, and just as Lewis was something of an expert on the Consolation, his good friend Tolkien was an expert on Beowulf, and Lewis was expert in everything, really. But anyway, Beowulf, and read the great essay called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics by J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings. And he'll say that the author was clearly a Christian monk. He's anonymous, but he was clearly a believer. But when he wrote Beowulf, sort of like Knight's Tale, which of course is later, but like Knight's Tale, like Boethius, it is set in a pre-Christian world. And the author shows incredible restraint. He obviously loves his character Beowulf, but he cannot give him the Christian heaven because that is not available to him in his world. And so he stays true to the pre-Christian pagan setting of Beowulf by giving Beowulf the highest honor or the highest reward a Viking can have, and that's the super great Viking funeral and all that sort of stuff and whatnot. If you read Beowulf carefully, you'll see that every so often he kind of breaks in just a little bit that month. But again, he shows amazing restraint, and he does that. Now, interestingly, there's another book that does this, and it's called The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was a strong believing Catholic, and yet The Lord of the Rings is set in a world that is not only pre-Christian, it's pre-Jewish. So it's even earlier because Middle-earth is the earth. If you read the letters, it's pretty clear. But it is even before God reveals himself to Abraham. So it's way, way back. And again, Tolkien shows great restraint by not giving direct special revelation to his characters, though his beliefs find their way into the Lord of the Rings through general revelation. the same way Boethius does. And by the way, there's another book, Lewis's strangest and most beautiful novel, Till We Have Faces, is also Boethian in the fact that it's written by a Christian and points forward to Christ, but is fully set in a BC world that knows nothing of Christ and actually also knows nothing of the Jewish revelation. So to me, that's one of the really exciting literary influences of Boethius.
You've given us lots to ponder. We've got a reading list there. Is there anything else you would recommend reading to those who have read Consolation and enjoyed it, got something from it? It can be about Boethius or by other similar authors.
One of the things I do, if you're interested in this concept, I wrote a book called The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes. It's actually available on Audible. I actually did the audiobook for that book. It's the only time I ever did that. Pretty exhausting job. But anyway, there I tried to take 50 myths and show how they point forward towards a greater truth that the inventor of the myth would not have known about. I'm really fun. I also did one called From Achilles to Christ, where I look at the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Greek tragedies in the same way. And finally, From Plato to Christ, looks just at Plato and the way things in him can teach us truths, but can also shine a lamp on the greater truths that are to come. Those of you that are enjoying Boethius, you really should read Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses, because those were the ones that were so influential on the later Middle Ages. They were the gateway, if you will. Another work that is set in a pre-Christian mode is actually Samson Agonistes by John Milton, which is the story of Samson turned into a Greek tragedy and written in a Greek tragedy. But again, Christ is never mentioned, of course, but it's also pointing forward. So I think and of course, Dante's Divine Comedy is something that needs to be read again and again in its powerful mingling of the Greco-Roman and the Judeo-Christian, bringing together a much greater fusion. Oh, well, one more thing, because this is often missed. Obviously, we want to read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, but Cicero wrote a short work called The Dream of Scipio that was incredibly influential. It's part of, Cicero wrote something called the Republic. And just like Plato's Republic ends with the myth of a myth about the afterlife, Cicero's Republic ends with the Dream of Scipio, which is a vision of the afterlife. But we've lost almost all of the Republic. But luckily, the Dream of Scipio was preserved in a Latin translation and exerted a great deal of influence. It even influenced Chaucer, but throughout the Middle Ages. So I would encourage looking that up, the Dream of Scipio, and to see what it does and its influence on Boethius and also on Dante.
Thank you very much for that.
One last thing. What about King Lear? Again, nobody knows what exactly Shakespeare believed, but King Lear is clearly set in a pre-Christian pagan England as being seen by the eye of at least a Christian culturally, if not a believer. It's hard to know, but there's just another example of that kind of writing, that kind of genre that Boethius helped open our eyes to.
Lou, thank you very much. You've been a marvelous guide to Boethius.
Hey, thanks so much, Elliot. Thanks for doing this. And this is a book that I think needs to be revived.